Hi, I am Dori Azar, and in the video segment today, I am going to show you how we can create quickly using Caligraphy Quill REST APIs. As you know, REST APIs are a way for you to interface with the database of a service out of an application without having to go through a typical user interface, but doing it through requests from the browser. So in order for us to create the REST APIs, we first need to make sure that we have a small database that we can work with using Calligraphy. So let's go ahead and do this. I am currently on the GitHub website for Caligraphy Quill, and this is where most of the documentation of calligraphy resides. So I'm going to go into the documentation part that speaks primarily about relational or about databases in general. Okay, so I'm going to go to the models section over here, which is going to show us how we can, one, activate the database, which happens to be obviously a MySQL database in at least the local server that I'm currently using, and how we can quickly create a model based on the database that I already have in the system. And from that point on, we will see how we can start interfacing with that database and how we can create a REST API using Calligraphy. So the first thing that I'm going to need to do is obviously open my VS Code on the My Calligraphy installation that I currently have installed, which is typically right now there's nothing on it, so it's still completely empty, as if it's a fresh version of Calligraphy that was just installed. If you don't know how to install Calligraphy, I strongly recommend that you visit the video, the installing Calligraphy video, in order for you to be able to catch up with what I am going to talk about today. All right, so the first thing that I need to do, and in my distribution or in my local server, which is currently running, it's a MAMP server that's currently running. So it has a MySQL, an Apache, and a PHP on it. It comes prepackaged with a PHP MyAdmin. Okay, PHP MyAdmin, for those of you who don't know it, is an application that would allow us to interface with the MySQL database without having to write code. Okay, so I'm going to use it in this video, particularly to create a database that we can use, which I've already done, but I'm just going to go in there to show it to you. Okay, so I'm going to go to localhost PHP MyAdmin, which is the way to access that application. And in here I have a bunch of databases. The one that I created specifically for this video segment is called My Calligraphy, just like just like my installation of the Caligraphy Quill framework. So if I go in there, you will notice that I already have two tables in it, one that's called projects and another one that's called users. I don't want us to worry about the users one just yet. Let's primarily focus on the projects one. Okay, and what I'm going to go do in there, I'm going to show you a little bit the structure of this table and what it contains. It has, a typical ID, it has a title, a description, and then created at and then modified at. There's also a user ID here, which we don't have to worry about just yet, which is supposed to be a foreign key. For the time being, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and drop this one over here. Okay, so I'm going to drop the user ID just in order for us not to get confused. All right, so why am I going to show you this? Because having the database, now how can we make sure that Calligraphy, one, connects to this database, and two, how can we make sure that it recognizes those tables within the code? And that's what we're going to be doing together as a very, very first step before even talking about how to interface with the database. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the .m file, because there's a way to create connections with the MySQL through the .m file. And there's an entire section in here that speaks about the connection to MySQL, okay? And since the connection with the database happens through an object model, we need to specify what type of database it is, and in this particular case we're talking about a MySQL database. Okay, and what I need to do is I need to set this to true to say that we would like to activate the database connection. Okay, that's the first thing that we need to do, and then I need to specify the database name, the username, and the password that I'm going to be using. Now the database name, we just saw it together, it's called My Calligraphy. Okay, The username is root, it's the default username, and the password in the case of a MAMP installation is typically also root, okay? Now, if it happens that you have another username and another password, you could use those as well, but at least for my local machine, this is, this is the admin, those are the credentials of the admin user, so I'm gonna go ahead and use them as is. Great. So now this activation is done. So I don't have to worry about the .m file anymore. Great. So now what I need to do is I need to find a way to create a model out of the database the database that we have. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the model section over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it project.php. Okay, why project.php and why did I choose the name project? It's because my database or my table within the database is a projects table, and I would like the model to actually model what a typical one project object is how it's represented, and that's what exactly we're going to do in PHP. So first, I'm going to open the PHP quotes. I'm going to say we are using calligraphy namespace, and then we're going to use the model that comes out of the box with calligraphy, and then we're going to create a class called project in this case, which mimics the name of the file, and it's going to extend the model that comes out of the box with calligraphy. Okay, and all we need to do with this model, and now I'm going to go back to my structure over here, is we are going to have to instantiate those properties in that model. And that's typically everything that we need to do. And the way to do this is we're going to define a public ID, okay, and then we're going to define another public, and all of them could be public or protected or even private if you want to. But I would strongly suggest that you keep them public, at least for the need of this demo. Okay, and don't forget, so I'm going to just copy and paste things over here. Same thing, we're going to do public created at, and then public modified at. Okay, so now we do have a representation of the model. So technically speaking, the model has been formalized in a sense that now every time we go and fetch something from the database, Calligraphy is capable of mapping it into a project that it could use from within. Great, but now we haven't done anything to interface with that database yet. And this is when we're going to go to the controller, and within the controller, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it project controller. And what that controller that we're creating is going to be doing, it's going to be our primary mechanism for interfacing with the database. All right, so the best way to create a controller in Calligraphy is actually very well documented in the documentation if you want to go and take a look at it, but we're going to do it together right now. And it's also a class, okay? So what we're going to say, the class is called project controller, and it extends controller, similarly to what we've done with the model. All right, great. Now, when we create a controller, what goes within the controller are a set of commands or a set of actions, and those actions are, at least in Calligraphy, represented as functions. And there is one typical function that is automatically executed from the moment we call the controller, and that would be the index function. Okay, so that index function, I could give it, by the way, any name I want, but the index is the one that is automatically executed from the moment the controller is invoked. Okay, so from the moment we say anywhere in the code that we want to access the project controller, it's going to execute the index function, and I'm going to use that function to fetch everything that is in the database. Okay, so to get me all the records that are within my projects table in particular. So how do we do that? The first thing typically that we need to do in Calligraphy is to associate that function with the model and with the table that it's going to be interfacing with. So in this particular case, our model is called project, okay, and our table is called projects with an S. So now I've done the association. So what this does is this function now knows that we're actually dealing with the project model, and that project model is using the projects table from the database behind the scene. Great. So now that this association is done, what I need to do next is I need to find that method or that function that could allow me to go get all the records within a particular table. And luckily, if we open the documentation over here, and I'll go back to to the uh, the table of content, and if we go to the controllers documentation, at the very end we can see all those methods or all those functions that we can apply from within the controller, and one of those is called the all function. And with the all function, it's going to go and get everything that is within that table that we are associating with. So what I am going to do is I'm going to say, let's say projects, okay, which is the name. I'm going to store everything in a variable. Is this is how we invoke the controller itself, and I'm going to call all, okay? And from the moment I call this function, it's giving me all the projects. Now I need a way to show these projects out. So we could do the basic dump function, which would show it on the screen directly. That would help us test a little bit. So I'm going to start with that one, and I'm going to go ahead and dump the projects. Okay. So let's go now and test what this has done in our world. So in order to check what we've done, I'm going to go to localhost, but this time to my calligraphy, which is the name of my application that I just downloaded. Okay, and so far, obviously, we don't have anything yet. Why do we not have anything? Because we have not yet defined a route. We never said to calligraphy when it is going to execute the project controller, right? It needs something. It needs a command coming from the request in order to do that. And that's what we call routing. So I'm going to go to the routing file over here called web.php, where all of the routes that calligraphy understands are defined. And we can see that out of the box, there are several routes given to us, but those two are given for at least demonstration purposes. What I am going to do now is I'm going to create our particular route, which is going to be /projects, okay? And what I'm going to tell it to go to the controller, so basically to run the controller. And like we said, I don't need to specify any action in here because it knows that from the moment it's invoking project controller, it is actually going to execute the index function that is within. Great. So now that I have this, now I gave it away, or I gave the user a way to, by simply entering projects and appending it to the root of the application, ideally it should call the function index, which in this case is returning nothing. Why is it returning nothing? It's because we do not have anything in the database. So let's go now and add something to the database to really test whether our application is working. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a title. Let's go, this is a test, so test from phpMyAdmin. Okay, so description, this is a test. Okay, created at and then modified at, those are created automatically for us, and so is the ID, so I don't have to do anything else. I'm going to go ahead and add it. So now let's go back to projects. Ideally, I should have one over here, and if I refresh my page, ideally I should be able to see the project that I just added, which is test from phpMyAdmin. Awesome. So my function is then capable of reading everything from the database, which is exactly what we needed. But now the format that it's actually dumping it on the screen is not the format that we would like to use in a REST API. And typically in a REST API, we would like it to be in a JSON format, which is a JavaScript object notation format. So how do we do that? In fact, Calligraphy comes pre-packaged with a function called API that actually prepares our results in a way that is consumable, or in a way that is JSONified, okay? So that it could be read in a standardized way by any other application that is accessing it. And the best way to do this is to call the API function. And the API function does take an array. And in that array, I could say I want to send projects, okay, and to projects I want to give it all the projects that it was capable of finding, and that's it. All right, so now let's go ahead and refresh it to see how this changed, and look at the result. Okay, the result is that now I have a list of projects, and it happens that in that list of projects I see the project that I just created. But notice the formatting of it. This is typically a JSON format. Okay. All right, so now let's go back to the code, because what we've done is we created our first index function that gets us all of the projects. Great. Now let's do something else. Okay. How about we go ahead and then we create something. We create a record to the database. So let's go ahead and create a function. Let's call it add, because that's exactly what we will be doing. Okay. And the first step, like we said earlier, the first thing that we need to do is to associate. This needs to be done no matter where what function we are creating. Even if it feels redundant, or if you feel that it's redundant, you can create another function that that does this association and call it from everywhere if you want to. Okay, but given that it's not a lot of coding, and for the purpose of this demo, I will just use it that way. So now what we want is, in this add function, we're going to make it also associated to project and the projects table, because this is the one that we're going to be acting on. Great. So now what we need to do is we need to fetch information. We're adding, right? So what we need to do is we need to find a way to get the user input and then add it to the database, right? Because that's the whole point. We would like the users to create those projects, so they are the ones who are giving the names, the titles, and so on and so forth. And we want to find a way out of the request itself to get those inputs in order for us to be able to create a project in our database. So how do we do that? Calligraphy has the ability to, and we can find this in the documentation as well, to get to reach the request. Okay, so basically, if we go and we say this request, it's going to get us everything that the request is giving us. So let's go to the documentation over here, and as you can see, there is something called the request, which I'm hoping we can find it here in the documentation. If not, yeah, it's here, right? So it has a property called request, which will get everything related to the request. Okay, and what are those things that are related to the request? And now what we need to do, we'll go back to the documentation, and we're going to go to the request section, which is literally going to give us all those methods that we can apply to the request object, and to figure out which ones is the most appropriate for us. And if we read all these functions, the ones that we want is the one that retrieves everything that the user enters, and this is called parameters. Okay, it's going to get us all the request parameters, and this is exactly what we want. We want to go ahead and get all the request parameters from the user. So let's take let's do this together, and let's first probably try and go ahead and dump this information over here. So I'm going to go ahead and dump the parameters, and what we need to do now is we're going to create another route. Every time we do something, we need to create a route, but this time the route needs to address a particular action, and that action is the add. And we're not going to call it projects at this stage of the game. We're going to call it project/add. Okay. So now when I do project/add from my request, ideally I shouldn't be able to see anything but a blank page, right? Because I'm not actually returning anything. I'm only returning what's coming with the request, which could be probably by default it would return the URI for us. Exactly. Okay, so everything that comes with the request, or everything that that we return, is how Calligraphy understands the request, and for the time being, all it understands is that it's giving us a URI. Now let me show you this. There is a way to append things to the URL to say, all right, to my add function, I want to add some parameters, and I'm going to call one parameters. Let's call it the title. I'm going to say it's hello, and by using the ampersand, I'm going to say the description is going to be from a browser, something like that. Okay. Okay. Now notice how my request changed. Now my request understands these the parameters that I appended to the URL. Okay, and this happens only for a GET request. Okay. which typically is not the one that is recommended to be used when you're posting to a database. I will show you that later. But for testing purposes, what the browser is capable of giving us, the browser alone from the URL is only capable of creating GET requests. We need HTML forms in order to create post requests, but we're not going to do that, right? We want everything to be done through requests. So basically, it needs to be done through the address bar over here, and we don't want to necessarily create a UI. That's the whole point of a REST API. So what we're going to try and do temporarily, just for demo purposes, we're just going to rely on the fact that potentially the inputs are given to the to Calligraphy through this mechanism. Okay. All right. So now let me go back to the code. The code basically is getting me the parameters that I want. All right. So I have the list of parameters based on this. So now all I have to do is I have to create a new object. I'm going to call it project. Why? Because it doesn't exist. Right. And we want to create this new project over here. And what I am going to do is I'm going to set the title of this project to what comes from the parameters, which is an array, right? So I'm going to say, I'm going to take the title, and of course we're going to validate if it's available. So if it's set, then we're going to take it. If it's not set, okay, and if it's not set, then let's set it to just the empty string for the time being. And same thing we're going to do. Project description. I'm going to copy this whole thing over here. Then we're going to say it's description. Okay, and parameters, same thing, description. And that's all I need to create. Okay, so now my project has a title, has a description that is coming from, that is coming from the URL, from not necessarily the URL, but from the request itself. And then now all I need to do, once I have done all this, I'm going to say save. And what am I saving? Project. And let's validate this method. In order for me to validate this method, I need now to go back to my controller, because the controller has a function called save. That function takes the object that we would like to save to the database. Let's validate that over here. Okay, so it's save, it takes the input, and it saves an input array or a model to the database, which is exactly what we want. Great. So now let me go back to the code. So now that I saved the project, ideally, this should add something to my database. Let's see if this is true. I'm going to try and add now the hello and from browser to my database. Okay, something happened, we think. Let's go to our database. Let's refresh the page. And here we go. We just added hello from browser. Now, of course, we didn't get any feedback over here. So if you want, what we could do is we're going to return, because we need to return something to the API, right? We're going to return this save project. Let's add another one to see what we get. It gives us the project that we added. So now if I refresh the page, I'm actually adding over and over the same project with the same title, same name, but of course the ID is regenerated over again. Great. So this function is actually adding the stuff that we need to the database. And now we're going to stop here a little bit, because of course we can do editing, we can do read only one project. There's a whole bunch of functions, of CRUD functions, or what we call CRUD functions, which is create, read, update, and delete, that we could do. We could also if we want, do the update and delete if we want to. But for the purposes of creating the REST APIs and showing you how it's done, just handling these two functions or these two methods could help us illustrate a lot of the challenges that we typically have when we are building REST APIs. Great. So now there's one more thing that we need to do before we actually start talking about an API. Now, typically this is a GET function, right? Because we're reading from the database. Ideally, this one should be a POST function because we're adding to the database. We don't want to do it through a GET necessarily. And basically, we just did it this way to test it out. So now if I go back to my web.php, instead of it being a GET over here, I'm going to do it's a POST. okay? Because we are actually adding to the database, and I'd like to use what is typically recommended through requests, which is really using a post. The difference between the two is that now I do not pass the parameters using the URL anymore, okay? It is actually passed with the body of the request. But you're going to tell me, where do I get the body of the request? The browser doesn't allow you to do this without writing HTML forms. So how can we test it? How can we test if our API works? Because that's basically all we need for an API. Now our API is actually built. Okay, we have a way to get a project out of this URL, and then we have a way to add a project just using a URL. So how do we test it out? So we're going to use an application called Postman, and I'm going to open it up for you. And what Postman does, it mimics a little bit how requests are sent through different types of ways. So there are multiple different requests. We have the post, we have the get, we have the put, and then we have the delete, and then we have options, etc., etc., etc. So Postman gives us a way to mimic or to actually create requests of different types. All right. Now the browser can only do one, which is the get. And through HTML forms, it can do post. So at most, a browser can give you or could help you do a get and a post. Postman gives it all. It can give you the ability to do whatever you want. So I'm going to open this collection over here just to show you what I'm talking about. This is a way for the way for Postman to do it. Look, it looks exactly like the browser, and those are all the different requests or the request types that it could allow us to do. The ones that we are concerned with calligraphy, and the ones that we can do with calligraphy, is the get, the post, the put, and the delete. All right. So we're going to go ahead and use that. All right. What I'm going to do is, ideally, if I copy the URL of the two URLs that I have, which, by the way, in the world of REST APIs, we call them endpoints. So this now is an endpoint that is going to give me access to all the projects that are within my database, right? And ideally, this should work. So now, typically, when we're doing things like that, we need to tell the browser what sort of it's application/JSON is what sort of output am I expecting. And in our case, we are accepting application JSON, right? Because we are our server is outputting a JSON format file over here. So let's go ahead and run it, and you're going to notice something here. It's saying access denied. So by default, Calligraphy actually blocks people from, blocks outside applications from accessing its content, which is more than expected. So what is that way that Calligraphy needs to give to tell people, all right, you're allowed to access my information or to even act on my database from outside Calligraphy? So what is that way of doing it? This is what we call an API key, all right? Every API needs a key, and that key is, just like the name indicates, it's like a password, or it's like a way to recognize that the application has been given or has been granted access to the content of the service. And in our case, our.env does have already an API key for us to use. However, this API key is used because anything within Calligraphy itself, within the root of Calligraphy, also needs a key in order to access information from the database. So we can go ahead and create another key through the terminal. So I'm going to go ahead in here, okay, and I'm going to go to my root file, to my calligraphy file, and we're going to use Calligrapher, which is the command line interface of Calligraphy. And Calligrapher gives us several different methods, different things to do. One of the things is generating API keys. So I'm going to go ahead and use the generate API key that comes with Calligrapher, and here we go. I just had one. Okay, it just created one for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that API key over here. We're going to go to Postman, and what we're going to do in Postman, we're going to take it to authorization, and that API key is what we call a bearer token. Now I can replace that bearer token with the new one that I just took, which is the one that is granted for my calligraphy, and I'm gonna hit send, and here we go. Now I can see a JSON of all the projects that we created together today. Great. That's our ad. So I'm gonna go ahead and save it temporarily now, and I'm gonna say, sure, I'm gonna save it under the name read all projects. Okay, that's the beauty of something like Postman, is it gives you a way to, and I'm going to put it in my test collection. I'm going to go ahead and save it. Now it's going to appear here. Okay, like this every time. I don't have to recreate it over and over again. It will open it for me automatically. I just send, and then I see it again if I want to. Great. So now we created our read all. How about we create our ad? And ideally now it's a post, right? That's what we said. We said it's a post. Great. And what is the endpoint for posting? That's when we go back to the route to validate that. Our endpoint for posting is in localhost/mycalligraphy/projects/ad. Great. So let's do that. Localhost/calligraphy/mycalligraphy/projects. I used the one from before, and I'm going to append it with an ad. Okay, we do have a header to create, same as it's an application/JSON as well. And I have a better token, which we need to do, which is exactly this one. All right, this is the one. Let me just paste it again. Yes, that's the one. Okay, and now what we need to do, we need a body. Remember I told you earlier that in order for us to add to the database, now it's a post, and with the post I can no longer send it as or send the parameters with the header, meaning I can no longer send it by appending the parameters to the URL. What I need to do is I would need to send it within the body. Okay, so the body of my request over here, how am I going to express it? I'm going to create a form data, just like we're creating an HTML form, and I'm going to say, I'm going to add a title, I'm going to say hello from Postman. Okay, and I'm going to add a description, and I'm going to say hello again. This is description from Postman. Now notice that I chose this format over here, but there are multiple ones or multiple other ones that we could use, okay? Now I chose this one just because it's easier, but if you want to do it in a different way, we can go and do a raw way, and then we can choose to do it in a JSON format as well. So instead of doing it in a form like this, we can create an actual JSON that you know, would be something like this. I can say title equals hello from Postman. Okay, and then description, this is from Postman, okay, or something like that. I might have some errors over here. That's better. Okay, so I could, and maybe we'll go ahead and try both, but let's first start with the body, okay, and then let's say we're gonna send it as a form data first, just to see if it works. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, something happened over here. Seems like ID 4, which is, you know, somehow close. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page over here. Oh, now I added another one. Okay, let's see. 4, 4, 4, 4. Does it say hello? Here we go. It's hello from Postman. Let's look at it in the database. Let's refresh. Here's my fourth one. Hello from Postman. Awesomeness. So now let me go back to Postman over here. What I'm going to do now, just for the sake of the test, I'm going to go to raw. I'm going to change it. I'm going to say hello from Postman JSON, and then this is a JSON body. And let's see if it works. All right, something worked over here too. So it says ID 5, hello from Postman JSON. This is a JSON body. So let's now go ahead to my database. Let's refresh it. And here we go. We just created the exact same thing in a JSON format from Postman. So what you just saw today, just going back here, what we just saw together, and I'll close these, is that after we have a database and we modeled our database And then we created those actions or those methods that allow us to interface with the database, which are typically the CRUD functionality. From that point on, my controller is actually what is gonna become an endpoint, or the route to my controller is gonna become the endpoint of access for my REST API. Okay. And that's all we need in order to create very quickly a REST API in Calligraphy. In fact, by default, Calligraphy assumes that all of its controllers are meant to be used as APIs, which means that it needs to give us a way to block access. And the way to block that access, there are multiple ways, but one of the ways is using the keys, or having the need to have the keys or to distribute keys in order to access those APIs. Otherwise, it would not allow external applications to use them. The other way, and now I'm going to go back to my web route over here. The other way, if we absolutely do not want to activate APIs by default, if you look at the web.php file, which is where our routes are created, that first statement on top is the one that is actually activating the APIs by default out of the distribution. Now, if you don't want to activate APIs at all and you want to restrict access, we can comment it out. And now, if I go back to my Postman, I'm going to try and do my get again, okay, and run it. Ideally, it's denying me access because the APIs are no longer activated. Let me show you that again. I'm going to activate it again. We'll be able to see. And when I deactivate it, it restricts access to all. Same thing if I try to add access denied. Okay. Now I'm going to go back and grant it or activate it. So this is Calligraphy's way of having you create APIs relatively quickly. I hope you enjoyed this session. We will, throughout the documentation, you will see more of these videos that could show you in very brief ways how you can do certain things with Calligraphy. Thank you very much, and then talk to you and see you very soon.